Okay, good morning. We're going to be talking about the reflexive verbs from Estructuras 7.1 and about the indefinite and negative words from 7.2. If you have your Vistas book, it's on page 236 and 237. And what we're going to be talking about are verbs that are called reflexive verbs. And if you just stop for a second and look at the word reflexive, you can hear the word reflex on it. And in English, we don't really have reflexive verbs, and we definitely don't have reflexive pronouns. So in Spanish, too, it's something that's just kind of understood, but the reflexive verb and pronoun are there to remind us that it's reflexive. Basically, what a reflexive verb does is it's used to indicate that the subject does something to or for himself or herself. For example, if I say, I wash my hands, it's understood in English at least that I do it myself. It's not that my mother is washing my hands for me. I'm doing it on my own. In other words, like it says here, it reflects the action of the verb back to the subject. Reflexive verbs always use reflexive pronouns, and we're going to talk about what those pronouns are today and how to use them, where they go, etc. And basically, they don't necessarily translate as anything because in Spanish, just like in English, it's understood that if you wash your hands, you do it yourself. It would be redundant to say, I wash my hands myself. And in Spanish, that's not what people are saying. It's just a different type of verb to signify that the subject does whatever the action of the verb is for him or herself, oneself, if you want to say. So like the example that's here, Joaquín se ducha por la mañana. Se ducha is a reflexive verb, and you know it's reflexive basically because of this se that's here. And we're going to look on the next few slides to talk about how you know which verbs are reflexive and what you need to do with them. All right, so basically that's saying Joaquin showers himself in the morning. All right. Okay. The verb lavarse is a reflexive verb, and you have many, many verbs that are on page 237 that are common reflexive verbs, and they're all going to work the exact same way as lavarse. But first, let's just look at lavarse. Basically, what you're going to do is the se lets you know, hey, I'm a reflexive verb, and you're going to have to put the appropriate reflexive pronoun based on whoever the subject of your sentence is. So you can see here the reflexive pronouns are me, te, se, nos, and se. Now, what are you going to do with the verb lavar? We're going to take the AR off it like you always have, and you can just put your regular present tense ending on it or your preterite tense endings, depending on whether you're talking about the present or the past. So here you've got me lavo, te lavas, se lava, nos lavamos, se lavan. And so the conjugation of the verb isn't any different. There's nothing special about it. What's special here with reflexive verbs is remembering, hey, I have to do something with this say. And you're not conjugating the pronoun. You conjugate verbs. But if you want to think about it sort of that way, you have to make it agree with the subject. So for yo, it has to be me. For tú, it has to be te. For usted, él, or ella, se. Nosotros, nos. For ustedes, ellos, or ellas, it's also se. And that's what's happening with your reflexive verbs. Let's talk about some other things that go on here. Okay, all the reflexive pronouns have the same forms as the direct and indirect objects that you learned about in lesson 6 and in lesson 5, I think it was. All of them except for say. Say is used for both singular and plural subjects. There is no individual plural form. So if you remember from the previous slide, we used say when we were talking about third person singular, like Pablo se lava, or when you're talking about third person plural, ellos se lavan. All right. Vamos a continuar. Okay, basically this is not rocket science, but important to understand. The only way you can know that a verb is reflexive is if it has a say on the end of the infinitive. Okay, that's the clue for you. The pronoun se attached to an infinitive identifies the verb as reflexive. So lavarse could also be just the verb lavar. Lavar isn't reflexive, but lavarse is. Why? Because of the se attached to it. All right. When a reflexive verb is conjugated, the reflexive pronoun agrees with the subject. And that's what we were talking about earlier. If you're going to say, I do something, yo me afeito, the me has to agree with the subject, which obviously here is O. The way we know is because the verb is conjugated with an O on the end, and that's the present tense ending for the subject, yo. Te despiertas a las 7. Despiertas, you can tell by the AS on the end of it that we must be having the tu form as the subject. And therefore, we have to make our reflexive pronoun agree with whoever the subject is. In this case, our subject is tu, and we could tell again by the AS ending on despiertas that the reflexive pronoun that's associated with tu is te. Okay? Next, I've got a question for you, a pretty simple one. And I'd like for you to take a second to answer this. It says, true or false, a reflexive verb has the pronoun se attached to the infinitive. And then you can just click A, true, or B, false, and click submit, and you'll see what the correct answer is once you hit submit. Okay, we're going to continue talking about the reflexive verbs here. Let's get the slide to pull up. Okay. Right now what we're going to do is talk about where you put the reflexive verbs. And just like the object pronouns that you learned about in Lesson 6 in the past chapter, the reflexive pronouns generally appear before a conjugated verb. And remember, a conjugated verb is one that's not in the infinitive form anymore. The infinitive of a verb still has the AR, the ER, or the IR attached to it. So just like with your object pronouns with infinitives and present participles, you can either place it before the conjugated verb or you can attach it to the infinitive or the present participle. And when we were talking about the object pronouns back in Lesson 6, I said, my way typically is keep it as simple as you can. So I tend to prefer in my own work to remember the first rule, put it before the first conjugated verb. So like with this example here, ellos se van a vestir, the se is your reflexive pronoun and you're placing it directly before the first conjugated verb, which is van. And then another way you could write it, if you want to, ellos van a vestirse, and they've attached the se to vestir. And for a lot of people, this way is easier because that's the original way they probably saw the verb, vestirse. Either way works. Here's another example. Hola, Grant, I just saw you popped into the room. We're talking about the reflexive verbs. Okay. Nos estamos lavando las manos means we are washing our hands. And then you could also use the same sentence, estamos lavándonos las manos. And the only difference is in the second sentence, they've attached the reflexive pronoun nos to the present participle lavando. And on the next slide, we'll talk about how if you choose to do that, just like the object pronouns, you're going to have to add an accent mark. And that gets a little bit tricky, but it's not impossible to learn. Let's see. So if you're attaching the reflexive pronoun to the present participle, you have to add an accent mark just to keep the original stress on the word. So bañándose, afeitándose, and the choice is yours. Either way works there. And I see, Grant, that you're back. Welcome to the session today.
Thank you.
All right. And so with the reflexive verbs, let's look at what some of the other ones are. So far, we've just kind of been talking about, we saw how the verb lavarse was conjugated. And all these verbs, you may or may not have ever heard of them or had them before. One of them on this slide that I know all of you have seen and used is the verb dormir. And if you'll remember, it's a stem changer from O to UE. And a lot of these other verbs, though, you may have never had before, just as vocabulary words. And as you noticed in the whole theme of the chapter, of the lesson rather, it's about personal care, personal hygiene, your daily routine. So these are all things that typically one does to oneself. And so we're going to be talking about these other reflexive verbs that are here. If you are going over these, learning how to pronounce them can be tricky, especially some of these that switch from O to UE in the present tense. But let's just go through the infinitive form first, and then we can talk about how they're conjugated. Repiten, por favor. Acordarse, acostarse, afeitarse, bañarse, cepillarse, despedirse, despertarse, dormirse, ducharse. And the common thing, hopefully, that you were hearing over and over and over again is that all these verbs are ending in se. And that, of course, is what indicates that they're reflexive. So, for example, with this first one that's here, to remember, acordarse, it's going to change from O to UE. Remember the rules for that. Now that you're starting to learn the preterite, it can get confusing to remember what you're supposed to do with all these stem changers. But if you'll remember in the preterite, the AR and the ER verbs don't stem change at all. So you're off the hook with that. In the present tense, though, all subject forms except nosotros will have that spelling change. So just in the present tense, if you want to say I remember, you would say yo me, take out this O here, drop in the UE, take off the AR and put an O on for yo. So you'd say yo me acuerdo, yo me acuerdo. Tú te acuerdas, él se acuerda, nosotros. Now remember, in the nosotros form, you don't stem change. So it would be nosotros nos acordamos, ellos se acuerdan. And you can conjugate any of the verbs that are here. Just remember that there's an extra little piece added on, given that these are reflexive verbs. You have to make the reflexive pronoun agree with whatever subject you're talking about. All right? The next slide is another list of common reflexive verbs, and we'll kind of be doing the same thing with them. Grant, do you have any questions while we're here about any of the reflexive verbs or how to use them?
No, ma'am, I don't.
Okay. We'll go ahead then and go on and look at some of the other reflexive verbs. Same thing. These are all going to end in se. Let's go through which ones these are. Repiten, por favor. Enojarse, irse, lavarse, levantarse, llamarse, maquillar, peinarse, ponerse. And again, you have the same verb, ponerse. We're going to talk about the meanings on some of these as we go through them. Again, all of these, what should be standing out to you as you pronounce them all is the se that's on the end. And again, that's what makes it reflexive. Without the se, enojar just means to get angry. And ir, you've had the verb, remember it was conjugated voy, vas, va, vamos, van, is just the verb ir if you don't have irse on it. And the meaning changes a little bit. The verb lavar also, you've had just as the plain old verb lavar, like to wash the dishes. Yo lavo los platos. There's no need for a reflexive pronoun because unless I'm in a magical kingdom where the plates wash themselves, I'm doing the washing. But I do, for example, wash my own hands. Yo me lavo las manos. Down here with the last two that are here, as far as examples, ponerse, remember the verb poner means to put or to place, and poner was conjugated, it had an irregular yo form. Grant, do you remember the yo form of poner in the present tense?
Pongo?
Pongo, that's right. Because if you don't know the regular form, you would think it was maybe pono, P-O-N-O, but it's pongo, P-O-N-G-O. So if you're talking about I put the books on the table, you would just say pongo los libros en la mesa. However, if you're talking about putting on some clothes, putting something on yourself, on your body, then you would say like yo me pongo los zapatos. I put my shoes on. Yo me pongo mi chaqueta. I put on my jacket. Another use of the verb ponerse, it's going to get conjugated the same way. The yo form is pongo, is to put an adjective with it, typically an emotional adjective like angry, sad, happy, nervous, scared, etc. And it means to become that particular adjective. So, for example, if the teacher just told me that our test is open book, then I would become very happy. So I could say, me pongo feliz, me pongo feliz, me pongo alegre. In contrast, if the teacher says, we have a pop quiz right now, get out a sheet of paper, the students will become nervous probably. Se ponen nerviosos. Ellos se ponen nerviosos. And so that's what they mean there by put an adjective. They're talking about an emotion, typically, a feeling that someone has. Let's see, and I think we have one more slide of a huge list of these common reflexive verbs. There's a bunch of them that you guys are responsible for this time. Let's pull that one up. Okay, and this the last set of them. Repiten, por favor. Preocuparse, probarse, quedarse, quitarse, secarse, sentarse, sentirse, vestirse. Okay, so on this particular slide, you have 4 verbs that are stem changers. And remember, in the preterite, your AR and ER verbs, you're not going to have to stem change. Verbs like sentirse and vestirse, in the very next lesson, the next chapter, you'll be learning how to handle the IR verbs that are stem changers in the preterite. For now, we'll just be using them in the present tense. And remember, in the present tense, with stem changing verbs, you have that spelling change. You swap out the E and replace it with the letter I, for example, with vestirse, all the way through every form except nosotros. So just remember that that's how you work with stem changing verbs. Sometimes you can forget what you learned earlier. And with these verbs, I don't know that there's anything special to say about any of these, but this is the verbs that you're responsible for, and a lot of these were on the opening pages. What page was it? It was 226 and 227, and so these should be coming full circle for you to be able to have them make sense. Grant, do you have any questions while we're right here? No? Okay. The next thing I have for you guys is just a quick question. If you will answer it by clicking on the bubble beside the choice of answer that you choose and click submit, and then it will show you the correct answer. It says, how would you say she gets up in Spanish? And then you'll put your answer and click submit, and then you'll be able to see then what the correct answer was. Okay, so Grant, I know you've answered yours and you have the right answer there. We'll go ahead and talk about a little bit more about these reflexive verbs that are here. Okay, basically all I want to talk about here is the fact that English and Spanish are different. We knew that. That's why you're taking a whole class on Spanish. No big deal here. These are just some things that help you understand a little bit better. Basically, in English, in the first place, we don't really have reflexive verbs. So In Spanish, there are reflexive verbs. Some of them can be reflexive, and then the exact same verb, if you just don't put the se with it, can be non-reflexive. And we talked about this earlier with the verb lavar, and that's what they're doing here. And here's just another way of phrasing it. Maybe this will ring a bell with you if the other ways haven't. Basically, if the verb acts upon the subject, it's a reflexive verb because the subject of the sentence is receiving the action of the verb, I guess, if you want to think of it that way. In contrast, if the verb acts upon something other than the subject, the non-reflexive form is used. So like if you compare these two sentences, you'll see what we're talking about here. Lola lava los platos. Lavar is your verb, and the thing that is being washed is the plates. And the plates are not the subject of the sentence. Lola is. So this is a non-reflexive use of the verb lavar. In contrast, Lola se lava la cara. Again, the subject is she washes, but what she washes is herself, her own face. If it had said Lola washes her son's face, that wouldn't be a reflexive verb either because her son isn't doing it himself. But here it is reflexive because the thing that's being washed is Lola. Okay, it's her face. That's part of her. So that's what makes it reflexive, if that makes sense to you. And two, the meaning can change. Lavar, to me, isn't really a good example here because they both mean to wash, right? Of course, if it's reflexive, it means to wash oneself or to wash up. A good example to me is like the verb ponerse with an adjective, the one that we talked about on one of the previous slides, saying that someone becomes angry or becomes sad, because the original verb poner meant to put or to place. And ponerse feliz, to become happy, to me means something totally different. So the meaning of the verb can change up a little bit. One way I used to explain that verb poner to my students was to say, if you think back to your childhood, there was a song like Put on a Happy Face or something. And if you think about putting on a certain kind of face to reflect your emotions, you're still using that original verb poner with to put or to place. And that helps some people remember that meaning of it. Another issue that's here, nothing major. Let's get this to pull up. Here we go. And we've talked about this already too. There's a lot of verbs that were presented here that are IR verbs that are stem changers. And we haven't talked about how to deal with those in the preterite yet, and we will. You'll learn them coming up very soon in lessons 8 and 9. Some verbs are irregular in the preterite, like poner, and you'll pick that up in chapter 9. You'll just notice that hopefully the book conveniently avoids those verbs in the preterite from here until you learn what to do with them. Just know that when you're writing or you're speaking and you're wanting to use those verbs, remember that you haven't learned how to use them yet. If you, on the test that you'll have in a couple weeks over this material, if you end up trying to use a verb like these and it's one you haven't learned yet, I'm not going to take points off. I'll know you were making your best educated guess, but I will correct it for you just so you'll know what it's supposed to be. But you're not responsible for it yet. All right? And so, and like the verb ir and poner, you're going to see how all those work in the future. We can't do it all in one day. All right? Let's see. I think the rest, this is something that's very different in English and in Spanish. And Grant, I want to ask you about this one in just a second, what your experience has been. But in Spanish, parts of the body or clothing are generally not referred to with possessive, but with the definite article. And what that means, it's just a fancy way of saying that in English we do say, I take off my shoes, but in Spanish it ends up being La niña se quitó los zapatos. The girl takes off these shoes. But in English, because we do say my shoes, it translates that way. But in Spanish, when it's written and also when it's spoken, typically parts of the body and articles of clothing will not use the possessive adjectives like mis, tus, sus, nuestros, sus. If you'll remember those possessive adjectives, I can't remember off the top of my head what lesson those were in, but when you're coming up with an idea in your head, like something you want to say in Spanish, in English, your brain is telling you, for example, I brushed my teeth, or I need to brush my teeth, like the second sentence says, and you're going to want to put my teeth. And in Spanish, my is mis. But one thing I want you to try and stop yourself and remember is in Spanish, when it's written and spoken, typically you do not use the possessive adjectives with articles of clothing or body parts. So as a result, you have necesito cepillarme los dientes rather than necesito cepillarme mis dientes. It's understood, I think, but it's not correct. And Grant, I just wanted to ask you real quick, you had some experience in Mexico. Did you ever hear people, or do you remember if you heard people or people you know now using the possessive with it? Because I do hear people, personally I do hear people using it, but I wasn't sure. Have you ever heard people use the possessive either with articles of clothing or with their body parts?
Just the ones that know more English, and they're starting.
Right.
I had forgotten about that, but it's a lot easier to not use the possessive anyway. When you think about how your mouth has to move and everything to pronounce everything, it's a lot easier to say los dientes instead of cepillar mis dientes. Anyway, it just seems trabalengua.
It's like a tongue twister. Trabalengua is tongue twister. And that's been my observation, too, that the people that I know that speak Spanish that also speak English tend to have made modifications in their Spanish. Some people call it Spanglish, and some people get angry at that word. I happen to like the word Spanglish and don't think it's a bad thing. It's just natural. It's what happens when two languages or cultures mix together.
Hey, Orlando, he's the one that's teaching me my medical Spanish interpretation. Every time we leave class, he says, make sure you keep up with your two languages, you stay bilingual. Now, all he's meaning by that is not to mix Spanish and English. If you're going to speak Spanish, speak all Spanish, or speak English, speak English. He refers to it as speaking English, Spanish, though. Like if you said, necesito cepillarme mis dientes, that would be English and Spanish by his definition.
Yeah, because you're combining the grammar rules of the two different languages. You may be speaking in one language, but you're combining grammar rules from two different languages.
Right.
It's very interesting. That's one of the things that, especially in my own family, we have a native Spanish speaker and a native English speaker, and the mixture and the resulting language that results is kind of interesting. But just so everyone knows, in Spanish, correct, proper Spanish, I'm not saying you won't hear it, but the original correct, proper Spanish is typically when you're referring to parts of the body or articles of clothing, you'll use the definite article el, la, los, las, rather than the possessive adjective like mi, tu, su, nuestro, su. Okay? And the last two slides that are here are just a little bit of practice. Let me see real quick. Okay, and these are exactly what was out of the book, I think. Let me check real quick. Because sometimes the book is different from these guys, and it's also different sometimes from what's online. But it is using the same verb despertarse for these examples. And basically what you need to do is look at who the subject of the sentence is, and then decide, first of all, start at the end of the verb and take off the say. The say is going to have to go at the beginning of the verb phrase. And you're going to have to make the say agree with whoever your subject is. Number one was done from your book. Mis hermanos se despiertan tarde. Grant, if you'll help me out with number two, número dos rather, with tú, what reflexive pronoun would you use here to agree with tú?
Te despertas.
It would be te despiertas. And we're not going to do all of these this morning, but let me just so you can see despiertas. And so we can talk about, too, because people don't want to admit it, but they forget what to do with stem-changing verbs. First of all, the say, you got to take care of it. Take it off. Put it at the beginning of the conjugated verb. Te is what would agree with tu. And then you're going to need to conjugate the verb despertar. First step, get rid of the AR. Second step, because it's a stem changer, it changes from E to IE. If you have more than one E in the verb, in the stem, it's always going to be the second or the last one that's going to change. So this E right here in despertarse is going to come out, and you're going to replace it with the letters IE, because in the present tense, stem-changing verbs change in every subject except the nosotros form. So you've got tú te despiertas tarde, okay? Grant, if you'll just do number 3 real quick so we can see one that doesn't stem change, and then we'll be on our way to some other material.
Nosotros nos despertamos tarde.
Muy bien. Nos, because that would be the, I can't talk and type at the same time. Let's see. That would be the reflexive pronoun that agrees with nosotros. And then despertamos is the verb that would agree with nosotros. Again, in the present tense, you do not stem change with the nosotros form. So you just have the original verb, stem, despert, and then you're going to add the amos onto it. So nos despertamos. And we'll leave it with that. I think on the next slide, it's using the verb ponerse as an example. Yeah, here we go. All these different people putting on a jacket. And same thing here. You're just going to take the say, take it off, make it agree with whoever your subject is. For example, for él, it would be say. For yo, me, usted, say, nosotros, nos. And some people like to go through and do that part first all the way through, and then they go through and conjugate just the verb poner. And remember that poner was that verb that was special only in the yo form, and Grant reminded us earlier that it's pongo for the yo form. And the rest of the forms follow the rules, so it'd be pones, pone, ponemos, ponen. All right? Grant, do you have any questions with the reflexive verbs at all before we move on to the other grammar section?
Just to clarify, like on number 5, it'd be las niñas se ponen una chaqueta, with say being the agreeing with las niñas.
Yeah, it would be, you were asking about número 5. Las niñas would be like they, so you would use se, and then you would conjugate it, se ponen una chaqueta. And really that's kind of a, I don't know. To me, that sentence doesn't really make sense, the ones that are plural, because it sounds like the girls put on a jacket that they're putting on at the same time, like 2 girls putting the same jacket on. And I'm not sure with this one, número 7, el botones. That one's not in the book. I'm not sure where they get some of these things. Oh, well. Were you going to say something, Grant?
Well, I mean, I know what you mean, too. It doesn't make sense. Las niñas se ponen una chaqueta, but it's the same way with, to me, it falls in line with not using possessive words and explaining it. I mean, each one of the girls putting on a jacket is what we'd say in English.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense. I mean, it's understood that each of them is putting on their jacket. From an English-only perspective, it is a little funky to translate, though, to not say the girls put on their jackets. But it is each girl puts on a jacket herself is kind of what it's saying, themselves. They put the jacket on themselves. But anyway, we'll leave it at that. And we're going to go ahead and move on. If you don't have any other questions or comments, we'll start talking about the indefinite and negative words. Let's see. Let me get this to pull up real quick. Okay. The indefinite and negative words, some books, even from this exact same publisher, choose to refer to these as affirmative and negative words, and that helps some students understand it a little better. If you want to think of it that way, feel free. And definite makes sense too, but some people like to think of things in terms of opposites, like affirmative and negative, and then that helps them remember these as pairs, like algo y nada, alguien, nadie. But it's up to you how you want to refer to it. Even the same publisher books that I've used from them will refer to this as affirmative and negative words. So basically, indefinite words or the affirmative words refer to people or things that are not specific. For example, someone, something, some, right? You don't know exactly how much that is. And in contrast, the negative words are denying that there are the existence of these people or things, or they contradict the statements that are made, like no one, nothing, nobody, never, just your basic negative words. And in Spanish, all the indefinite words have a corresponding negative word, just like in English. There's nothing really super special there. But one of the big things that's different in Spanish and English that we're going to be looking at is that in Spanish, it's okay to have more than one negative word in a sentence. And there's several things we're going to look at that are different. Here's your indefinite words. If you had your book out, this is all on page 240 and 241. Again, it's all on page 240 and 241. If you like to have your book out, it's a little bit different sometimes, but it follows along pretty closely. These are your indefinite words, or if you want to call them your affirmative words. And what we'll see on the next slide is the exact same words having a corresponding meaning in the negative. And if you look at them in your book, they're right next to each other. They're not broken up by two slides. And I think that's a little bit more helpful for a lot of students to see them side by side. But let's go through these real quick just to be sure we know how to pronounce them. Repiten, por favor. Algo, alguien, alguno, algún, o, that one's not very hard, siempre, and en. All right? And then the corresponding words in the negative form are nada, nadie, ninguno or ningún, and then ni, nunca, or there's also the word jamás that also means never, and tampoco. All right, and basically what we're going to be doing today is talking about how these words are used, where they're placed, what you have to do when you're switching the sentences around. The first thing we're going to talk about is where these negative words go in the sentence. So basically, they're going to tell you that there's two ways to form negative sentences in Spanish. You can either place the negative word before the verb, or you can place a no before the verb and then the negative word after the verb. And we're going to see a couple of sentences written both ways so you can just see the difference. First of all, this one says, nadie se levanta temprano. Nadie is that negative word, and it's coming before the verb. The verb is se levanta. Because it's coming before the verb, you don't need a no. Okay? Same thing here with this example, they never get angry. Ellos nunca se enojan. Se enojan is your verb. Your negative word nunca is coming before it. You don't need a no. Okay? The rule is if your negative word comes before the verb, you don't need a no. Okay? In contrast, if you're the second set of examples, same sentences, just written a different way. If you're going to put the negative word after the verb, you do need a no before the verb to make it say not. And in English, this goes totally against what we've always learned. You can't have double negatives in sentences, but in Spanish you can. So for example, that same sentence, no one gets up early, an alternative way to write it is no se levanta nadie temprano. And here you've got nadie, your negative word, and you're going to need to memorize the list so that you can recognize what those are. It's coming after the verb, so you got to put the no there. All right. Similarly, with our "they never get angry" sentence, ellos no se enojan nunca. Nunca is coming after the verb, so you got to put a no before it. All right. So just to sum it up here, if you have your negative word coming before the verb, you don't need a no. If your negative word is coming after the verb, you must put a no directly before the verb. Okay? Let's see. And the next little thing I have here is an easy question. I just want to make sure you guys are all with me. This isn't the easy one. This is the hard one. Never mind. But if you will take a second and answer this question, and if you'll rewrite the sentence that's here with the blanks, I couldn't figure out a way to make it. There isn't a fill in the blank option. So it says make this statement negative by filling in the blanks with the correct words in Spanish. And the sentence is, yo tengo algo que hacer. And I'm helping you out by giving you the negative sentence. I just need you to fill in some negative words there. Yo blank tengo blank que hacer. And you would need to fill in the corresponding words that go there, that are your negative words to make the sentence negative. And when you hit submit, I think it will show you the correct answer. I hope it does. It does? Okay, good. Thank you, Grant. All right, and so hopefully you had enough time to answer that one. I know Grant's finished, and we'll go ahead and continue talking about these indefinite or affirmative and negative words. Okay, this right here, if you noticed on the slide, and it takes this too long to pop between slides, but if you look back up at the top of page 240, the list of affirmative and negative words there, there's certain ones that change if they come before a masculine singular noun. Basically, right here it says before a masculine singular noun, alguno and ninguno are shortened to algún and ningún. And there were other words that you've had like this before. If you'll remember, like bueno will change to buen, or grande will change to gran if it's coming before a singular masculine noun. So just keep that in mind. It's a spelling issue. All right. So, for example, this question: ¿Tienen ustedes algún amigo peruano? Do you have a Peruvian friend? Some Peruvian friend? No tenemos ningún amigo peruano. And the word amigo is masculine. You can tell because it's ending in an O, and it's singular. You can tell because it doesn't have an S on it. And because these words are coming before it, you drop the O off of them. All right. And just like in the sentences we just translated, alguno and algunos are not always used in the same way English uses some or any. Often, algún can just mean a. Okay, so ¿tienes algún libro que hable de los Incas? Do you have a book that talks about the Incas? And in English, we wouldn't say, do you have some book that talks about the Incas? We would say a book, and that's acceptable. You can translate it kind of as we do in English, even though algún technically means some or any. It's just differences in how we use the language between English and Spanish. Okay, and this one too, these are just things you can read through on your own. They're not going to be life or death situations, but they're things just to remind yourself of. Alguien and nadie, somebody and nobody, refer to people. So if you'll remember that little thing called the personal a, we talked about that when we were talking about the differences between saber and conocer. The personal it doesn't translate as anything. It's just there to let you know that you're about to talk about a person. It also can be used before alguno or algunos or ningún if they refer to people and they're the direct object of the verb. So that sounds really technical. Let's just look at this in action and real life examples. Por ejemplo, perdón, señor, busca usted a alguien. Are you looking for someone? And the a alguien, because alguien obviously is someone, a person, something living, you put the a before it. And then the guy says back, no, gracias, señorita, no busco a nadie. The a nadie is, also, I'm not looking for anyone. I'm looking for no one. And that's evidently some type of person. So you have to put the personal a there. Grant, would you read the second examples for us?
Tomás, ¿buscas a alguno de tus hermanos? No, no busco a ninguno.
Okay, and that there is basically the referring to the alguno. Are you looking for one of your brothers? The one is referring to a brother, which is a living person, so that's why they're using the personal a there. This is just trying to bring things to your attention to put it all together. All right, Grant, do you have any questions at this point?
I'm good.
Okay. Let's see. Let me get the next slide to pull up real quick. Okay, and this is what we were talking about earlier. In English, we were taught from a very young age in school that we do not have double or triple or quadruple negatives in a sentence. In Spanish, however, it is acceptable and it's encouraged. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. So, nunca le escribo a nadie, you actually have two negative words in it. I never write to anyone. And, of course, when you translate it, you want to say, I never write to anyone rather than saying I never write to nobody, because then you sound uneducated in English, and that's going against the point. So the second example here, no me preocupo por nada nunca, is saying I do not ever worry about anything. If you want to get picky and get super technical, and make a double negative in Spanish, you're basically saying I do not ever worry about nothing, never. And that just sounds terrible in English. Please don't speak that way. But it is an interesting point. In Spanish, it's fine to have as many negative words as you want, even more than two. You can have a triple negative there. But in Spanish, Spanish is different from English. In English, be sure you only use one negative word per sentence. But just be aware that it is okay. And for a lot of people, this is really funny. It's hard for them to break that rule even in another language because they had some teacher standing over them at some point in their life drilling it into them, whether it be a parent or someone correcting them, putting it in their head, you can't have a double negative. Well, in Spanish, you can. You're free now to use double, triple, quadruple negatives. Knock yourself out. So this next question was the easy one then. Must be my easy one. Let's see. Which language uses more than one negative word in a sentence? So you'll choose either Spanish or English and click submit, and you probably don't need your confirmation on the correct answer on that one, but it should be there. Okay, and we'll go ahead and move on then. Hopefully you saw the correct answer and you're aware that which language can use more than one negative word. And this is just, okay, muy bien, Grant, que se encuentra la respuesta. This is just going over that same information again, that in English, once you have one negative word, you can't use any more, okay? In English, one negative word only. In Spanish, however, once you use a negative word, you have to continue with negative words. The sentences that you're going to see in the practice kind of make that work. Let's see. Oh, it's not going to show us any more practice. As we go through these, though, you'll see what we're talking about. This is just a little detail, too, the difference between the words pero and sino. They both mean but they don't get used the same way. Basically, sino is used when the first part of the sentence is negative and the second part contradicts it. Otherwise, use pero. So basically, sino is kind of like if you were to translate it as but rather or on the contrary. And it could be just but since they both mean the same thing, you may need a way to distinguish the two. For example, los estudiantes no se acuestan temprano, sino tarde. The students don't go to bed early, but rather they go to bed late is basically what it's saying. And of course, in English, you don't hear a lot of people saying, but rather late. So know that that may sound a little bit awkward to you, but the idea is since both words mean but, you may just need a different way to distinguish them. Grant, would you read the next example about the towels?
Las toallas son caras, pero bonitas.
Okay, and it's not contradicting anything. The towers are expensive but beautiful. What about the next one, Grant?
María no habla francés, sino español.
Muy bien. So it's saying, if you notice, both of these sentences that use sino had a no or a negative word somewhere else in the sentence. That can kind of be, if you don't really understand this just yet, that can be your clue. If you have a no or a negative word somewhere else in the sentence, then you're going to say but. You have to use sino if it's got a negative word. So María no habla francés, sino español. She doesn't speak French, but rather she speaks Spanish. And then, Grant, if you'll do the last one for us.
José es inteligente, pero no saca buenas notas.
Muy bien. Jose is intelligent, but he doesn't get good grades. I'm sure that's a lot of people's excuse, right? They're really smart, but they just don't apply themselves. Be sure you apply yourself to this class and you'll do fine, but whether you're smart or not, you can figure it out. But here again, José es inteligente is an affirmative statement. You don't have any negative words there. Las toallas son caras. There again, too, there's not any negative words. So you're going to use the word pero rather than the word sino. Okay, not rocket science, but just something you need to have your attention brought to. Let's see. The rest of what we have here are just some practice exercises, and these were both longer grammar presentations, and we're kind of running out of time because I have another session with my 101 classes. So let's just do a couple of these. I know number one is typically done for you in the book. Let's start with numero dos, Grant. And basically what they have happening here is obviously a negative word coming before the verb or the negative word coming after the verb. And remember, if it comes after the verb, like in the second example for all of these, you have to put a no first. So the way these work, alguien se ducha, for example, con el número dos, tienes que pensar en qué es el opuesto de alguien. El opuesto de alguien es, Grant, ¿tú sabes?
Nadie.
Nadie, ¿verdad? Let me see if I can make it fit. Yeah, nadie se ducha. And then how would you do, Grant, the second example? It will mean the exact same thing. It's just an alternative way of writing it. What would we put here if we put?
No se ducha nadie.
Right. No se ducha nadie. Okay, and basically visually what I'm wanting you guys to see here, and by doing all this repetition, there's actually three more slides of this, and it's in your book as well. I don't think there's as much. Actually, I think there is exactly the same practice, and you'll do these when you do the Inténtalo exercises on the En Línea site. But you've got two ways on every single one of these to write it. And basically what you need to do is hunt for either the affirmative or the negative word and think about the affirmative word rather, and then think about what its opposite is. So like the opposite of también is tampoco. So in this first example, you'd fill in tampoco here. In the second one on número tres, you'd put no van tampoco, because anytime that negative word is coming after the verb, you have to put a no before it. All right, and I'm just going to flip through the other slides, otherwise you won't be able to scroll through them. And here again, if you want to practice these on your own, you definitely will when you do the Inténtalo exercises. And while I'm just scrolling through these, Grant, do you have any questions so far, either about the anything that we've been doing? You guys have taken your first test now.
No, everything is going smooth for me.
Okay, great. And I appreciate you coming today. I'm going to go ahead and stop the archive if you don't have any questions. Let's see.